Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks believed profoundly in the power of the written word and authored many books and articles that addressed major trends and issues of the day through the lens of Jewish values and Jewish texts. In an effort to honor his creative contributions and scholarship, Yeshiva University has created the Sacks Book Prize, generously funded by the Rohr family, to broaden the impact of Jewish scholarship in the arena of contemporary Jewish thought. The prize aims to recognize recent publications of ideas deeply sourced in Jewish texts with wide appeal within and beyond the Jewish community. I'm Dr. Shira Weiss, Assistant Director of Yeshiva University's Sacks-Herenstein Center for Values and Leadership, and I'm thrilled to present my conversations with this year's winner and finalists. Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum is Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies and the Rabbi Sacks Chair of Modern Jewish Thought. His book, Questioning Belief, Torah and Tradition in an Age of Doubt, was recently published by Koren. Rafi, congratulations on being a finalist in the Rabbi Sacks Book Prize.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful.
I know that you had a close relationship with Rabbi Sacks, both personally and professionally. Can you describe how you knew Rabbi Sacks and share an anecdote that illustrates the nature of your relationship?
Well, all of us of a generation who grew up in London had some kind of relationship with him. But I was lucky to be the madrich of some of his children in Bnei Akiva, so we always had that relationship. And then when I took over here at LSJS for almost a decade, I would meet him every 6 to 7 weeks because he was the president of London School of Jewish Studies. And as the dean, I would meet him and we discussed leadership issues and invariably Torah and the politics of the day. A story and anecdote. Well, I'll tell you it's about leadership, really. I was trying to organize a particular project at one point for one meeting, and he came down from upstairs in his house. So we'd meet him in his reception room, and he'd had his own agenda. He'd changed what I planned to do, and he said, "I want to do it this way." And I said, "No, Chief Rabbi, we're not going to do that. I want to follow this. I want to do this project." And he was like, "Oh, okay." And we went along with it. And then I felt at the end that I'd been a bit disrespectful and rude in the way I'd acted. So I said, "Chief Rabbi, may I just apologize for earlier? I didn't mean to be rude or whatever." And for the one time only, he screamed at me. He said, "No one ever tells me I make mistakes, Rafi. No one ever tells me that I'm wrong. And that's why I make mistakes. Don't apologize for correcting me." And so I was like, I'm sorry. I wanted to say I'm sorry, but obviously I couldn't. But it was interesting. He was very tough on himself to be challenging to encourage people to tell him or to critique respectfully, obviously, but to critique what he was doing. So, and I felt comfortable to do that. He taught me to be able to do that. I always wanted to, and it meant that we got further than just the niceties in the relationship.
In the book that Erica and I are co-editing on the thought of Rabbi Sacks that you very graciously contributed to, Dan Sacker, who also worked closely with Rabbi Sacks, commented in a very similar way. And I think it's really a testament to how Rabbi Sacks worked, that he appreciated those types of critiques. Your writing reflects the style of Rabbi Sacks, especially you're dealing with theological questions that he discusses in numerous works that he wrote. Can you describe how his writing inspired the way you approached and addressed these problems?
Well, he wrote beautifully, and he had a wonderful art of language. I've got more of a scientific training, and so I try and write very, very clearly and to justify arguments. What I learned from him: read everything on the topic if you can. Try to understand what everybody else has said and how it fits together in the past before you then approach what you're going to do, and be relevant for now. Respond to the way people are looking at the issue today, which is always changing. So I think I got that from him, and to always give a reasonable argument, to give it in more lay people's terms. The approach I've taken in the book is what I call, or he told me actually, it was called middle brow. So highbrow is academic, it's intellectual, it's rigorous, it's hard to read, and not many people read it. And lowbrow is simplistic, and it's not clear, it's unjustified. But middle brow is an attempt to take a solid argument, but explain it that anyone can understand it. Now, that's the idea, that's the approach.
I think you definitely achieved that because you certainly had well-reasoned arguments, but you presented them in a very accessible way. So I think a lot of readers will be able to gain from your responses to these really, really challenging problems. You broach really tough theological issues, including questions about belief, chosenness, and prayer. And you mentioned in your introduction how you personally grappled with or counseled congregants in your rabbinic role who asked you these types of questions. How did you decide what made the cut? How did you decide which specific questions to address in the book? And since these aren't new questions, how did you go about choosing which interpretations, which reasoned arguments to include in your responses to each?
Well, let me tell you, Shira, that the origin of the book actually came from a conference for elementary school Jewish studies teachers. And in the conference, I did a session on responding to difficult questions. And even though there were lots of options, I ended up with about 100 people in the room, and they just gave me a barrage of questions. Their children had answered them, but they couldn't think of answers. They didn't know a good way of responding. So in that session, I developed not only answers, but a way of responding, which I thought was fundamental. And I took down all those questions. And actually, I produced a booklet with a friend of mine, Maureen Kendler, about 5 years ago called Big Questions, with short answers on 33 of these issues. And we published it and gave it out to the public, and lots of young people read it, and adults said, we love this, but we want longer answers. So I decided to write the book and focus on, I think, 3 areas, which is how I've done it. I've done questions about origins, about the creation and about the flood and so on, but those are really questions about the truth of the Torah, or about literalism. How much do we take the Torah literally to be true? What's the purpose of it and how does it work? So there's a lot of questions under there, but I chose 4 from that general area. But the responses bring in ideas that are relevant to all questions about the veracity of the Torah. The second area is ethical questions, and there's hundreds of them that come from the Torah. But I wanted to choose ones that focused on fundamental issues like identity, and that's why chosen people came up. And then fundamental ways that we live, which is food, for instance. Food is a very important part of all lives, especially for Jews, and therefore attitude towards food, and what we eat and how we eat and so on, and therefore its resultant environment was a key issue. And I saw very clearly that it relates fundamentally to sacrifices. So people like to answer questions separately, but that's not how the Torah works. You really have to kind of take a different perspective to appreciate how the Torah relates to different ideas. And once you do, then you see it's answering questions in a different kind of way than what people expect. And the third fundamental issues were issues about God. What's the nature of God? What allows God? Can you argue with God? What happens if I don't believe in God? How should I pray? And so I chose a number of questions there, but again, they widen. So even though I've chosen these 12, they reach many more questions, actually, in the way that I do it.
You deal in part 1 of your book, as you just mentioned, with seeming conflicts between science and religion. And you address questions like, is creation at odds with modern science? Has evolution made Genesis redundant? You tackle the authenticity of the flood story and the Exodus narrative. How does your academic background, you mentioned you hold a PhD in physics, how does your scientific background influence the way you think about these challenges?
Well, it means that I can't ignore them, Shira. That's where I start. Like, once you understand the physics, it's very difficult to ignore that. So for the entire Earth to be covered in water 10, 15 above the highest mountain, there's not enough water in the Earth for that to happen. So obviously it could be a miracle, but then why give the semblance of a story that has some kind of natural idea to it and then make it miraculous in that general sense? So I'm always questioned by this. Now, obviously, at one level, God can do everything, and any miracle can happen. God can do it and ignore all of science. But that flies in the face of a number of things, right? Which is one, the Torah gives the impression of it being a real story. That's number one. Number two, Nachmanides and many others say that God tries to limit how much is miraculous and how much is natural. And Maimonides talks about very much, and I'm a big fan of Maimonides, my Yemenite background in general, he's the only one to have a major book in philosophy and halacha in all of Judaism. His Moedavuchim, the Mishnah Torah, are fundamental to all Jewish learning, so he can't be ignored. And he argues very clearly that Olam kamin hagon noheg, the world follows a natural path as much as possible. And therefore, it was a great relief to read the Rambam as a kid, I must tell you. But therefore, to understand my science, I was brought up as a scientist. I was made to think in that way. I couldn't ignore that and put my head in the ground and ignore things once I understood that approach. And therefore, it always intrigued me. Now, originally, I knew about physics, so issues about creation I was very aware of. It was only much later, issues like evolution. I remember coming out of university thinking, can a religious Jew believe in evolution? Because doesn't that contradict with the Torah? And I was starting from scratch. But my scientific background taught me to think systematically, to understand not what was Darwin saying philosophically, but just scientifically, what was his argument? Did it really clash with what the Torah is saying? And it made me go back to the Torah over and over again, look at different commentaries to understand it had a very different purpose to what science was. So it really pushed me. I couldn't ignore these issues anymore. But the more I studied, the more it helped me understand how science and Torah are very different things. They're complementary. I'm sure we'll talk about that. They're complementary, but they're very different things.
Speaking about the purpose of science, you quote Albert Einstein on page 25 of your book, who writes, "Science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from religion. To this there also belongs the faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is, comprehensible to reason. I cannot imagine a scientist without that profound faith. The situation may be expressed by an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." You also quote Rabbi Sacks, who discussed in his book, The Great Partnership, how science and religion are the two great partners in human development. Rabbi Sacks writes, "Science takes things apart to see how they work, while religion puts things together to see what they mean. As a scientist and a rabbi, how do you view the relationship between science and religion, and how do you then reconcile those seeming conflicts?"
Right. Well, to answer that one on one leg is really difficult.
Yeah.
There's a number of chapters that relate to that issue. It's a beautiful quote from Einstein, because you see as this major successful scientist, and incredible realizations, that for him, there was underneath the even search, the assumption in science that the world is consistent and intelligible. That's a faith that he has, and he calls that a religious faith, which is interesting. It immediately shows the relationship between the two. Now, Rabbi Sacks, as you mentioned, talks about in his book, it's actually called The Great Partnership, that they're partners, these two. But I want to be a bit sharper on that particular issue, because they're partners, but they're very different. They're complementary. I kind of see it as a division of labor, right, or a sharing of the load. They look in different kinds of ways. And they never contradicted historically. It's a real newfangled issue that they do. Let me just give you an example that Karen Armstrong writes about in her book, in her book about God, and articles as well. She talks about logos and mythos. Logos is the human approach to reason and logic, and mythos is man's or humanity's mythical or spiritual ends. And she says, look, just go to ancient humankind, when they would hunt animals by day and then they would kill them at night, and they would sacrifice to the gods and thank them for being successful in the hunt. And she said, how could they do that? In the hunt, what they were doing was purely logos. They had to know the weight of the spear, the airspeed, in order to chuck the arrow accurately to hit the beast. They weren't praying to do that. They were doing very practical actions, and they knew they had to do that accurately in order to, and that they knew that they'd killed the animal. It was them that did it. But at night, when they thanked the gods, and they burnt some of the meat up in sacrifice before they ate it, they were showing a kind of thankfulness to the greater reality of the world. They never saw a contradiction between what they'd done in the day and what they were doing at nighttime, which in a way is science, technology, and religion and faith. They understood they were complementary. One was the physical ability and the scientific know-how to achieve something, and one was what was the meaning of the action that they had done. And they knew that affected them. They didn't use that language, but they knew that it affected them in some psychological ways. And therefore, the two had to go together. And one other approach that I mentioned in my book, which is even more interesting, is a kind of an art and a scientist who talk about that science is the penultimate curiosity. That originally, humans were always questioning, why are we here? What's my purpose? Where do I come from? And they began to give answers to answer that, which were religious originally. But then as they managed to be successful in the world, they came up with technological and scientific answers to some of these questions that then took on a life of their own. But that really science swims in the slipstream of ultimate questions that faith gave us, which brings me back to Einstein. So again, the relationship between the two is complicated. It's not one or the other. They always went together. It's a modern aberration to think that they are complementary. To my mind, a little bit foolish. And that's why I quote Einstein in a footnote where he sees them as kind of foolish in the way they're looking at this, to kind of set one against the other. The real reasons there are competitions is because of ideological issues, not because of the disciplines themselves. It's because people don't want to be religious, and therefore they will use science to reject that. Or religious people don't like development of science, therefore the rejection of it. But I've always embraced the two and had a deep belief that it would have to be that they work together. As many have said, that God's words and God's works fundamentally can't contradict. And if they do, I've misunderstood. I need to go back to the drawing board and study them more.
I appreciate how you related ancient Jewish dilemmas to contemporary applications. Like in the chapter which questions the fairness of collective punishment, you discuss the IDF's practice of destroying the house of terrorists. The question of collective punishment has certainly been highlighted in the current war in Israel. You address the question through multiple interpretations of very challenging biblical stories like Sdom, Amalek, Shimon and Levi's destruction of the people of Shechem. How do you understand the Torah's approach to this issue, and how does it inform our contemporary understanding?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge with what's happening in Israel today, and our main aim is always to support Israel 100% and pray for success, and that people should be safe, and that ultimately in the long term there'll be peace in the region. These are fundamental issues, and the Torah does grapple with these issues from at the end in Devarim, when they're about to enter the land, and what that will mean. What does it mean to conquer? What does it mean to have control over land? And what are you allowed to do and not allowed to do? And this is a very complicated subject, and I decided to give a contemporary issue to kind of really crystallize it. And it's, as you said, it's the issue of house demolitions. If a terrorist who's known to have done terrible acts, that the family, the house of the terrorist is demolished. And the question is that acceptable? That's collective punishment? You're blaming them. Are they responsible? So you could argue it's nothing to do with them. But then again, if they lived in the house and they acted in this way, they didn't know what they were doing, they weren't aware of it, they didn't try and influence them to do anything different, do they share some aspect of the responsibility? And that's the fundamental question. By the way, this is about demolishing a house, not killing others as a collective punishment, which is a very different thing. And the Torah is very against that in many, many ways. I made some very important points, which are, one, that with Sodom and with the collective drowning of the Egyptians and the attacking of the Canaanite cities and Amalek, in all those cases, it was sanctioned by God. You needed the the Tumim, the special magical, to an extent, or mystical use of the breastplate to justify it. It had to be that God was saying it had to be done. Without that, you couldn't necessarily do that. So already, collective punishment was questionable. Later on, we have Pesukim and Ezekiel that make it very clear that a person only dies for the action that they did, and you can't make someone else responsible. So once you take out of the picture Hashem being involved in it, then you have to look through stories in the Torah that don't involve God commanding. Because once God's involved, you can't compare it to today, because then you would need a divine action. We don't have those. So in the end, I come up with two stories in the Bible, one in the Torah, one in Nach, which are about that. One is the story of Shimon and Levi. They do collective punishment. When their sister is taken and raped, and the man wants to marry her, they go in and kill the entire city, and Jacob goes mad with them. Was it justified what they were doing, that aspect of collective punishment? So it's a very, again, I'm sorry for a long answer, but I'll just try and do it as briefly as I can. You see very clearly that the Shimon and Levi actually offered at first that people should get circumcised. Mm. Now, some people think that was just a ruse, right? Oh, they just got them circumcised there a week and they'll go in and kill them. But the Sforno and others say, no, they were serious. If you will get circumcised, if you will accept the faith of our God to some extent, then we can intermarry with you, and it'll be fine. But what happened is that when the leaders went back and told the people, they did it in a way that made it clearly pernicious, that they were not interested in it, and they actually were about taking over control. And Shimon and Levi saw this, and so they saw the city as culpable. And when you look at the different commentaries, Maimonides and so on, they all try and argue that the people in the city were all culpable for some reason or other. Now, whether that argument works, in other words, whether they can make it clear that it's culpable, the reason they're saying that is because if they weren't, it would not be justified what Shimon and Levi did. So again, collective punishment as an issue is not justified. There's another great story of David HaMelech, which is very complicated, but I'll leave those people to read the book to find out about that one. The key issue I want to end with, and this relates to demolitions, which the Israeli Supreme Court said is justified. It can be done under Israeli law, but they advised that if it's not effective as deterrent, that it shouldn't be done, and it should be reviewed continually because it can be so misunderstood and misapplied. And for me, that reminds me of the pasuk in Devarim, where it talks about when an idolatrous city has to be wiped out, that the pasuk says, which means God will give you mercy and be merciful to you in that He will allow the city in terms of dealing with the city. And the commentaries ask, what's this extra phrase? And God will give you mercy. And this Shira is the key. It says that if you end up having to wipe out the city that God told you, even though it's justified, it will make you a cold, callous, bloodthirsty person. It's not healthy getting involved in this. And therefore Hashem has to particularly, the pasuk says, God has to give you extra mercy afterwards to get back to an even keel because it's changed you. Now, this is an incredible statement. What it implies is that without God helping you to do this, then being collective punishment, even when fully justified, would make you an immoral person or a callous person, which is unhealthy and therefore should be avoided. And so we end up with this very difficult balance of what to do. Now, I know the Israeli army is making every effort it can. It's got a whole division dealing with international law of how it deals with these issues, and it does not justify collective punishment. That's not what is being done. Sometimes if mistakes are made or it's not clear enough, then dangerous things happen and certain civilians, and it's very sad, die. They've been asked to move. There's warnings, just like in the Torah as well. So the chapter is a very difficult one because I try and do this thin line, but I wanted to bring up all the sources and the way of analyzing it so that people can see the serious justice and morality that's in the Torah and how it grapples with these real issues. Because, when you use people as human shields, you are in a moral quandary. So I hope this chapter is helpful for people in kind of challenging and dealing with these moral issues. But sometimes it's quite difficult to deal with them when you're in the thick of war. And it's often after war, when reviews are done, that these issues can be addressed in a more calm way.
Right. The topic of chosenness you raise in another chapter. And the issue has been critiqued for racism or at least elitism, especially considering in the Kuzari, Yehuda Halevi's conception of the Jew's distinctive quality, what he calls an inyan Elohi. And you mention Halevi in your book, but you describe chosenness ultimately as not inward-looking, but outward-looking and filled with responsibility. Can you elaborate about how you conceive of the Jew status as a chosen people?
Yeah, it's an important subject because it goes directly against the issues of equality of our society, that we shouldn't judge people differently because of race, color, or creed. It's a challenge. The Jews think they're better. And worse, we say it every day, Asher B'chabanu, God who chose us. And every child in elementary and high school, Jewish schools, is taught about this. So it can lead to a kind of egotism and a betterness, which is a very dangerous approach. So again, I went into the sources to understand it. And there's what I try to give as a historical story. And often I was taught from my teacher, Rabbi Sacks, to do these kind of things. Look at the historical context of the sources that you're finding. And it starts off actually that it's not that in terms of chosenness, it starts off that we chose God. If you look at the sources there, it's very clear that we had this deep relationship and that we wanted to be close to God, which is a fundamental, different way of looking at it. But what I try and argue is that the Halevi period, and this, by the way, it's not just Yehuda Halevi in his writings, and there's a lot of them where he talks about Jews being on a physically higher level than others. This then comes out in the Zohar, and then later Hasidic works in the Tanya as well. It's a particular strand of Judaism that started in the medieval period. And the reason I think that came about is because Yehuda Halevi, when he looked around in his time and saw the Christians and the Muslims warring and killing each other in the name of God, he literally thought they were mad. He thought they were less than human, crazy. And therefore, as a way of trying to give confidence to the Jewish people and understand that we're fundamentally different, he saw we're essentially not like them. We have to be different. And so this strand came along, which got picked up by the Zohar, as I said, and the Tanya. But that was only one strand of medieval philosophy. There are many other ones that said, no, not at all. What is the purpose of being chosen? So I in modern language, Shira, I call it as basically the Jews were the early adopters of monotheism. So you know, when a new iPhone comes out or a new technology, some people are early adopters and they tried this out before other people, and they get into it, and then they become, the inspirers of others to get involved in it. We were early adopters of monotheism. And that's what the chosenness is all about. And that led directly to being chosen, therefore, to share what we understood. And therefore, our job fundamentally is to share this belief in monotheism with the world. Chosenness, therefore, doesn't make you better. It gives you a responsibility. And I also talk about, by quoting the Rambam and Midrashic sources, that you don't have to convert to get all the grace of God. Maimonides makes it very clear, other Midrashim as well, that you can just be just as close to God without converting. Because without that element as well, then you would be in some way higher. And I wouldn't accept that. So it's the reverse for me. And Hirsch writes about this so beautifully. It's about sharing this message to everybody else. If you're arrogant, not only are you, it's a complete reverse of the point of having a particular task to do. So that's how I saw it. And it really turns everything on its head when you understand it in that way.
Yes. In the latter part of your book, as you mentioned, you deal with questions of belief. And in one chapter, you address how a human can argue with God. And you write, we must be reverent enough to follow faithfully, but close enough to argue ardently, and still always thoughtful enough to work out when each is appropriate. How does one know when it's appropriate to protest or argue with God, and when one needs to restrain oneself?
Yeah, when you accept or when you challenge. The greatest irony, right, is that the greatest example of acceptance of God over everything is the Akedah. When God tells a man to sacrifice his son, it's an unnatural thing, the Midrash says. And we normally see that as the ultimate level of acceptance. And yet at the same time, one of the greatest challenges of God is Abraham challenging God as Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? How can you destroy it? And the fact is they're in the very same sedra, the same portion. So the Torah wants us to compare and to contrast the two. And you can try and come with different answers of one God invited Avram to critique, and one God just told him to do it. One was external to a city, one was about his own personal life. And you can go with these things. But what I did is look at the way the rabbis understood it. And they changed the lesson of the Akedah. So we think the lesson of the Akedah is acceptance of God. But if you look at the little rabbinic paragraph that's after it, there's a tradition all the way back to the Torah about reading the Akedah every day. And straight after, there's a little rabbinic paragraph that's been put in there. And it says, and it's if you have to read it a number of times to notice what's going on, it says, just like Abraham conquered his mercy in order to do the will of God, so should you, God, conquer your anger and be merciful to us. Now that's a flick. They've turned acceptance into petition. So actually the rabbis saw in every case of even acceptance, there can be a challenge. It all depends on what your relationship is. Like if you have and this is the case when you have a relationship with somebody, if you're a good friend of yours, when is it appropriate to critique them? Well, it all depends on the depth of your relationship and understanding of each other. So if your friend knows that you're critiquing respectfully and that you've got and that you have their interest at heart, then you can do it. And the same with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If we're clearly accepting the principle of what God's asking us to do, then it's always okay to challenge. So the acceptance isn't acceptance or challenge. It's about acceptance of respect and relationship. And within that relationship, then we can always ask. And we always continue to do it. And that's why I tell the famous story. And I looked up the source of it as well, where Elie Wiesel talks about, it's an amazing story of putting God on trial in the camps, and yet afterwards finding God guilty and then going to daven afterwards. That's a perfect example of petition and acceptance, because it's out of love of God. Of course we're going to daven afterwards. How can we not daven mincha afterwards, right? Even after you put God on trial. Because we're friends. We're close to Kadosh Baruch Hu, and that allows us to do it always. And I ultimately try and argue in the chapter that God is like a trainer for us. God is training us to argue and petition for goodness in the world. God wants us to challenge him. That's what a trainer does. They spar with a boxer. Example of a young boxer, they spar with them to make them punch better. But of course, the boxer has complete respect for their trainer, because they know that they're training them to be better at boxing. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at the relationship.
Rabbi Sacks writes a lot about that in Tehillah Fractal World, the importance of protest. In the same chapter, you analyze Abraham, as you just mentioned, at the Akedah, and Moses, who both argue with God. And God acquiesces to an extent to both of their arguments. But you don't discuss Job, Eov, who could be described as the biblical paradigm of protest. Why do you not include him in the chapter? And what do you make of God's not being receptive to Job's demands? Ultimately, in terms of what you were just saying, Job ultimately acquiesces by the end of the narrative. But what do you make of Job's protest and God's response?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do mention Job at the beginning of the chapter as others, and I try and argue that Abraham and Moses are the beginning of the issue, and Job is a later version of it. Also, for the rabbis, Job is not a real story. It's a theoretical, philosophical story. And also, Job is talking about his own family. Whereas for Abraham and Moshe, it's for others. For Moshe, defending and arguing for the petitioning for the whole of Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people. And Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah, not even people of part of his family. In fact, people who he'd spent 25 years disagreeing with. Because, way back when Lot first left him in chapter 13, already Sodom is counted as Ra at that point. And Avram's 75 at that point. And by the time God appears to him and says, I'm going to destroy Sodom, he's 100. So for 25 years, Abraham lived down the road to a place that he saw as immoral, that he was worried about, he didn't agree with. And yet when God comes and says to him, I'm going to destroy it, he doesn't say, about time. He says, really? How can you? So Avraham and Moshe are examples of leaders petitioning not for their own families in real scenarios to take on God. Whereas Job is a very different thing. Something's personally happened to him. So it's more of a kind of personal theological debate. And Rabbi Sacks, in his Telefactual World, has a whole chapter on Job and brings it back to the Abraham and Moshe argument, because that's where it really begins. But what I wanted to try and show is, in my chapter, is that both Abraham and Moshe, you see a pattern of how they argue, how God encourages them to argue, how Hashem accepts to some extent, and will forgive to some extent, but also to some extent won't. And therefore that becomes the paradigm of petition. So Job is interesting to discuss philosophically, but I am a very practical person. And Abraham had a real issue on his hands, a wider issue than just his own personal family, and Moshe as well, as leaders. So they makes them very, very different. So that's why I focused on the Torah stories as opposed to going to Eov.
In a chapter that you entitle, What If You Still Have Difficulties with Beliefs?, you redefine the term emunah. And you write, to have emunah is primarily to be trusting, committed, and faithful to the Jewish nation and their dedication to God. Trusting in the people with whom you share centuries of history, celebrating festivals and life cycle events with them, and caring for their welfare. Committed to your own Jewish community, other communities around the globe, and to Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people. Faithful to generations of Jews who, despite life's vicissitudes, have shared a common purpose, living meaningfully through their culture and traditions, knowing they could always rely on God. Typically, emunah is conceived of as a faith in God. What motivated your definition that focused more on a sense of belonging within the Jewish community?
Well, first of all, I do a whole chapter on what belief might mean. And I use lots of scientific and psychological arguments to look at a very different and poetry, to look at a very different kind of way of what it means what belief means in God. But what I wanted to do is then do another chapter for people who have difficulties. Some people are tone deaf and find it difficult to relate in that way. And I wanted to show them that the word emunah, the way the Torah uses it, is much more than this kind of objective belief, I know something or don't know something. And actually, it's very Christian, as I show in the sources. It's not very Jewish way of looking at things. And so I then talk about this idea of loyalty and faithfulness. But there's a wonderful midrashim that makes it clear. Like, who is the person who knew God existed more than anybody else, who saw God face to face, who understood more than anything, was the most objective understanding? Moshe Rabbeinu, beyond any doubt. And yet in the Torah, Hashem says, because you don't believe me, you do not believe in me, you're not going to the land of Israel. So how can emunah mean belief in an objective existence and then say that Moshe didn't? The whole paradigm Rambam gives is that you have to believe in, Moshe had the highest level of it. So it makes the point very clearly. The last thing the Torah should do is say that Moshe didn't believe. And yet he's the one. It's an amazing thing. So clearly, emunah is a much more complicated idea. There is not a one-to-one translation between English and Hebrew words. So emunah is a collection of ideas of loyalty, of trust, of faithfulness. It's much more faithfulness than faith and what that means. And that's why I get into that issue. And again, since we talked about Rabbi Sacks earlier, I'll say it was an issue that he mentioned to me many times. And I saw in a book by Rabbi Novich that it came from him, who was his teacher. So he taught him, and Rabbi Sacks taught me, and I quote it so often. When I get upset with Am Yisrael sometimes, he would say, Rafi, ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. They are believers, the children of believers. You can't challenge them. That was Moshe Rabbeinu's mistake, right? And he wasn't saying they all believe in God, Shira. What he's saying is that they are committed Jewish people. And we see that, unfortunately, in Israel today. Ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim, the way we are putting together, right? Some people might use the word God, many don't, but they feel connected. That is the faithfulness of the Jewish people done through history as opposed to objective, propositions of existence. It's a very Christian way of looking at it, actually. And it's weird how that's infiltrated Judaism. And then people sometimes feel they've got to justify it. And it's like, why are you talking like a Christian? Jews don't talk like that. So over and over again, I go back to the Torah and try to think, what does this word emunah mean? And it doesn't fit with what people think that it does. You have to read each context of it and you get a different feeling of it. I mean, deep down to all this share is, you and I, we're Greek. We were taught, in universities to think in a scientific or rational way that comes from Greek thought. Now, it's very useful and it's brilliant and it's very helpful, but Torah is something different. And if you try and fit Torah into Greek thinking, you're going to miss things. Torah's got a different perspective. And I believe, and I know you have as well, we have to let go of that to embrace a different way of thinking. And that's what ultimately Judaism isn't just an unusual faith. It's an unusual way of thinking, which takes time to understand. And our language and our backgrounds sometimes let us down. So even though I'm a big believer in modern orthodoxy and embracing the best of the modern world and modern thinking, I'm not foolish to think it's the same as Torah. Torah's something else. And when you put the two together and play between them, that's really exciting, as I know you found in your writings as well.
Absolutely. In the final chapter that you entitled Why Pray Today, you write that prayer really does have the power to change reality because it allows us to clarify our personal perception of reality. How does this change reality? What did you mean by that? How can it enhance one's connection with prayer today?
Right. You could always choose how you react to a situation. It's very, very powerful. You can't choose not to have a disease. You can always choose how to react to it. They did research to show that the happiness quotient of different countries. Turned out people in Israel were happier than many other countries. And the happiness wasn't necessarily to do with how much war there was in the country, or terrorism, or even wealth. It was a cultural thing. So God gave us an incredible mind that has the power to change our perception of reality. And again, my subject background really helped me with this. Are we really seeing what's really out there? There's a time delay between what we're observing and when we realize it in our mind. So we're not really seeing what's really there. And also, our eyes are deceptive in what they're actually seeing or they're hearing. It's selective. I remember when I was a kid, there was this great science program, and they gave someone these mirror glasses that made them see everything upside down. And they wore them non-stop for 3 days. And they woke up on the third day and it flipped. The mind had said, no, this makes no sense. And it flipped it. So they saw things the right way around again. And they walked around for a day like that. This was part of the experiment. And then after that day, they took them off again. And now they had nothing on, just looking, and everything was upside down. And it took a day for the mind to flip back again. So your mind you are not seeing reality as it perfectly objectively is. There is no such thing, right? It's all being siphoned and reduced in certain ways by your mind. And therefore, the power of the mind, which God gave us, can change our attitude toward things in incredibly powerful ways. It can't change a physical reality of a disease you might have, but what you do with it and how you respect it and how you deal with it, and therefore how you handle it, and it can actually change how quickly you are cured from it, if possible, changes you. And therefore, in that sense, I really believe it changes your perception of it. I didn't say it changes reality, change your perception of reality. What I'm trying to stress is that perception is much more powerful than people realize. And if that wasn't the case, why are we spending so much on therapy?
So how does that relate to prayer?
So in order to heighten your perception, you need an awareness. So in my chapter about prayer, because I noticed when we teach prayer, and I did it for many years, I try and explain the prayers, but I realized I'm starting from the wrong place. I'm starting from the book when I should be starting with the person. So I said to myself, Rafi, what do you care about? I love my children. I love understanding this world. I wrote down, what do I really care about? What do I want to be aware of every single day? Like a good lead of a company has their vision statement. They put them on all the walls to remind their staff about them. So I think, what do I really care about? And I came up with a number of issues, which I think are relevant to many people. And I looked at the Siddur and I said, it's answering those issues. The Siddur is an attempt to remind you to heighten your perception and to live every day with purpose, not reactively, but living out the values that you have. And that gives you a very strong perception. And then you won't fall into the trap of what's called mission drift. Mission drift is when you kind of forget what you were doing and you go along to some other project that wasn't your aim, or some other issue that takes you down another path. Davening 3 times a day brings you back. Why are you doing this? What's your purpose? Why are you in existence? How is it going? The Amidah gives you a chance to reflect on these issues. It heightens your perception. Are there other ways of doing it through meditation and so on? Of course there are, right? But a religious tradition that demands regular acts of reflection through prayer will heighten the perception in a systematic way. And that's what I try and argue that prayer does for us. And there's many other things as well, but that's the aspect we're talking about here.
We mentioned earlier in our discussion about the collective punishment, we mentioned the current crisis in Israel and even more extensively globally. How do you approach theological questions today regarding faith, evil, morality, given what's going on throughout the world, certainly in Israel, but also what Jews are dealing with in other parts of the globe?
These are very difficult things, and they take time to answer, to collect your thoughts. And the mistake people make is that they make judgments based on something that isn't true. So the first issue, a halachist or even a philosopher has to say, what is the nature of reality? And then I can analyze what that implies. The first thing is to find out the metzius, what's really going on. And the truth is, we don't know. It's very hard to make a judgment call when you don't really know what's going on. So I have a basic faith that the Israeli army is attempting to be a moral army. Now, many people don't, because they don't understand what conscription army is, right? Their perception as a liberal is always that by definition, any soldier is bad. And that's a misunderstanding of war. It's just not understanding the reality of it. So that's one aspect of it. But key is to know what's going on. And I don't know what's going on exactly. And therefore, I can't make judgment calls after the fact, when there's reviews and we have more information. It's much easier to then deal with. The example of the hospital that was very early on, that there was a bomb in the hospital and they thought hundreds had been killed. It turned out to be much less. It was in the car park. Again, people were jumping to assumptions before they understood the truth of it. So my first stage is, and people don't like this, they love to give opinions. You have to have the humility to say, I don't really know. In which case you have to have a basic trust. And I have a basic trust that the Israeli army is a moral army. Does it make mistakes? Absolutely. Every army does, right? And it has to learn and react to that. But I've got that basic trust that we're attempting to do things right. And that's the first stage. For years, there'll be books, PhDs, conferences, analyzing what happened in this. Please God, it should end soon. And then it'll be much easier to pick between these issues and analyze it. But it's a very difficult thing to do in the thick of it. And social media encourages us, Shira, to work so fast, and it's not helpful. The mind is not created to work in that way. And you can't make reasonable analysis, and definitely you can't do theology when you're in a foxhole. It's a very difficult thing to do. So the fundamental principles are emunah, as I talked about. Now, that you can get to a stage where you lose faith in an army and think that it's fundamentally immoral. And it's interesting, the debate about the justice system in Israel was happening just before. But once the war began, things changed very quickly. But I think a basic emunah in what's going on, in trying to trust of my people, is something that I have. And I've got every reason that I've seen to have that, the things that I've seen. For me, for people who don't understand or don't know externally, they see these men in green and they think of them as, gun-toting, violent people. I know that they're secular Israelis who want to go to the beach, or religious Israelis who'd rather be in shul than be there. But the last place they want to be is there, because I've lived in Israel, as you have. I've talked to them and I understand that they don't want to act immorally. They themselves have a moral conscience about these issues and feel terrible about it. So again, it's very difficult, and there are no simple answers, but you can't do theology in the middle of a war. It's not. You have to make decisions based on your structures and hope that you're getting it right.
The Sacks Book Prize was established to recognize recent contributions to Jewish thought and to encourage writers to deepen and to broaden the impact of Jewish scholarship. Your book, Questioning Belief, is your first book. What are your plans for your next work? Are there other questions that arose from the conference you mentioned at the beginning that you want to broach? Are there other areas that come up in your communal or academic realms that you want to address? What's next for your writing plans?
Well, thanks for asking that. I mean, it's, again, I follow Rabbi Sacks on so many of these issues and watched how he grew and developed. And he always encouraged us to be mechadesh, to analyze a theory and then add something. Always spend most of the shir bringing the sources, bringing the arguments, and then attempt to move it forward a little bit further. And I've done that for so many years that I've actually got a list of things that I'd like to get to. I love Midrash and Darshan and Bereshit, and I've got a book I'd like to talk about the genesis of sin and the use of the word chet. Again, similar to the word emunah is misunderstood, chet, we've been Christianized about the nature of what chet is. And interestingly, the word only occurs in 7 stories in Genesis. And not, by the way, in the Garden of Eden. The original sin, the word chet doesn't occur. It's a completely Christian way of looking at it. The first mention of chet is with Cain and Hevel. So I'd like to write a book about the origin of sin. But I also lecture here at the college in Jewish education. And for me, Jewish education isn't just who you teach or what you teach. It's also how you teach. In other words, there is a tradition of pedagogy in Judaism. There is no tractate of the Talmud called chinuch, but there are many examples of chinuch all over the Talmud, which I've been collecting. And I'd like to write a book about how we learn. And the working title, it might change, is called Pass It On, which is the understanding that chinuch is about dedication of a tradition that you're passing on, as opposed to just a informal explanation of information to young people. So pass it on is probably what I'm going to work on next, probably. But I do want to spend a lot of time traveling and teaching this book. And again, sure, my aim is not to give lectures on the book. It's to meet communities and ask them the question. I have to tell you, I had a very moving experience last year in Ra'anana, when I was asked to speak in a synagogue to the young people of the synagogue. And I thought it was going to be teenagers, but actually it was the 20-year-olds, many of them who were in Sabah, who were in Sahel, in the army, or just come out, and from a religious community. But they had fundamental questions about belief and about God. And I didn't sit there and give you, let me tell you my chapter. I asked them questions. I engaged and I listened to, I said, what do you believe is God? And I let them talk to each other about it. And they asked questions to each other. What's your understanding of God? And eventually they turned and said, so what do you think? And then I began to give some answers, but it was always answers or responses that related to them. So for me, it's not that the responses are the key in the book, but the process of looking for them, to believe that we have them, that God gave us the Torah that we can challenge and work through and try and make sense of, and that truth will emerge through the process. And at the end of the evening, which we finished at midnight, we were all transformed by the experience, and they felt more connected. Some things I'd said they really liked, some they weren't so sure about, but the process that you could engage is the key. And that's why I've called the book Questioning Belief, that my belief is a questioning belief. And that's what deepens my belief. We ask because it deepens our understanding, not because we're afraid, but because we know that there is truth to be found. And so that's the approach of what I'm doing in the book and what I'm going to go around with. And then after I've worked on that, then I want to develop, because this is an educational approach in this book, Pass It On, to talk much more about the different sources in the Talmud about education.
Well, I look forward to your future works and congratulate you again on being a finalist for the Sacks Book Prize. I know that questioning belief will create a major impact on Jewish scholarship and will have a very wide readership that extends beyond the Jewish community. Thank you so much, Rafi.
I certainly hope so. Thank you so much, Shira. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. Dr. Erica Brown, director of the Sacks-Herenstein Center, joins me in expressing our gratitude to the Rohr family, who appreciates the influence of books in shaping the Jewish future. We hope the Sacks Book Prize will catalyze more inspired and inspiring Jewish writing and scholarship.